And we're live. Post the link. Everything should be going now. Okay, there we go. Everything's on, and we're live.
Awesome.
All right,
Hi.
Fantastic. Hello, everybody. DC Perspective and I are back. We said that we would talk about foreign policy depending on what took place after the election. So here we are. And unfortunately, the thing that we didn't want to happen happened, and now we get to talk about it.
Yeah. And when did we last speak? Was it December or was it before the election?
I think we talked before the election. Let me check, and I can tell you actually. Content. Let me go to studio.
Holy cow.
We talked on live. YouTube Studio won't let me ever do anything right. We talked on December 5th, so it was after the election, but before all of the lawsuits and everything got thrown out. So when there was still hope.
Yeah, for illegitimate.
Yeah.
It's and now we're here dealing with the Joe Biden presidency. It's better after P. Savior for us to grasp onto anymore.
No, but I do find it funny that we're back in an era of messianic politics because everyone's treating him like Jesus.
Yeah, right. Have you seen the photo of the graffiti with Joe Biden on the Jesus photo, or on the Jesus graffiti, his face photoshopped onto it that was going around? And we've seen this throughout. You haven't seen that?
No, I haven't, but I'm not surprised.
Yeah, right. We've seen it throughout all administration. It's like when there's the ultimate devil, you need a God figure to grasp onto. And that changed throughout the course of, Trump's presidency, depending on what the issue was of the day. It was Ruth Bader Ginsburg or that one FBI investigator who wasted millions of dollars, Mueller. And now it's Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. And what are they doing? It's the pageantry, right? It's the look at the circus over here. Okay, we're gonna send a convoy into Syria on our first day in office. Look at the nice pin that Lady Gaga's wearing. Now we're gonna go and escalate tensions with Venezuela. Look at this beautiful dress that Joe Biden was wearing that matched with Michelle Obama at the inauguration. It's really back to 2008 politics, 2014 diplomacy, I think.
Well, hello chat, hello Mark, hello Jonathan. It's good to see you all. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Like I had said not too long ago, the fact that it's regressing back to sort of this Obama style, we're gonna just imagine that the last 4 years was just this, hallucinogenic nightmare. And we're going to just assume that everything is back to normal. I would say it's regressive leftism, but I don't want to use 2014 talking points.
Right.
And that's where we're at. But for today's stream chat, DC and I are going to talk about Biden's attempt for foreign policy, Antony Blinken, and what he will probably bring to the table as Secretary of State. And we'll cover trade, China, and Africa. So that's what we have planned.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
You wanna kick us off with what you were reading?
Sure. So I've got a bunch of tabs open, and I'll just start reading through with them. I want to start with trade because whether we like it or not, because you and I live in the middle of nowhere in our respective states. I live in a place where there's more cattle than people, which is kind of nice now that I think about it. After living in cities for most of my life, it's a lovely change of pace. But trade is going to affect all of us, especially in the agricultural sector. But Politico put out an article stating prior to the election that Tony Blinken, who is now going to be his Secretary of State, he served as the Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama White House. He said that tariffs won't be off the table as a weapon to be used in trade negotiations. However, they would prefer to engage in, trade negotiations and move from there because, they fundamentally believe that tariffs are acting like taxes on the American people, which to a degree they are, depending on what school of economics that you buy into. But what they wanted, his priorities were the following: was to reduce tariffs, particularly on its European allies. Trade deals are secondary. The Trans-Pacific Partnership has still been floated, but I don't think that'll ever be engaged with because of how unpopular it was. I mean, Hillary Clinton, who once championed the idea of the TPP, had to go back on it in the 2016 campaign. So, and then of course they're Europhiles, and that's where we're at.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, and it's true. And this term that's been floating around, the GAE, the Global American Empire, is really that. It's based in Europe. It is Europe-centric. They really care a lot about what Germany, how we're holding up in the standards of Brussels, and this weakness and passivity that we have towards Europe is probably one of the most damaging things that has really come to grip America since the fall of the Soviet Union. And see, during the reign of the Soviet Union or whatever, during the Cold War, I see the purpose for it, right? Caring so much about Europe, giving Europe so much money, being their defense. But at this point, it's this holding on to the elite, the managerial class. There's no other purpose for it other than the sake of feeling good as being comfortable, right? And once we get rid of these trades, tariffs, and we were so close to disconnecting from Europe and letting them go their own way. And with Biden back in office, we're not going to see that. Merkel is talking to Russia right now about some type of gas pipeline, but trade regarding Europe is concerning, but we also have to think of trade regarding China and trade regarding the rest of the world. Right now, I mean, the soybean prices are down like 70 cents. Corn is down like 50 cents. I follow someone on Twitter who was talking about how much money he just lost. He's a farmer. Says he works 1,000 acres and he just lost $100,000 on a 200 bushel per acre average of corn crop because of Joe Biden's consecutive orders. And this is weakening us economically. This is weakening us on the geopolitical stage. And, you know, what do you expect? These people view us as a nation in decline. And that's really, I think, the root of the issue.
Well, America's relationship with the European continent, and especially if you look at it from a historical perspective, the United States was the propagator and a large financier of diplomatic and political capital of the European project prior to the European Union and its formulation, to which at the time you wanted to unite a destroyed Europe post-World War II, and at the same time provide an economic powerhouse that can effectively stave off what would eventually be leftist interests in politics in the Soviets. Now, has that interest definitely changed since the fall of the Soviet Union? Yes. Does it still serve a purpose? Yes. The question becomes, what does the United States want to do with that? What we're going to see now that Biden is in the White House and that Antony Blinken will be most likely confirmed as the Secretary of State is that the traditional Wilsonian idealism of the American left in political establishment is going to come back. So you will see a more concentrated effort on improving a relationship with Brussels. And it is, yes, it's definitely Brussels and London based, as Melphis says in chat, because Brussels is the heart of the European Union. It's where the European Council is. It's where the president, Donald Tusk, is. So what you're going to see is a focused diplomatic attention there. Whether or not Biden is going to pursue anything that Trump has done over the last 4 years in regards to national defense, I'm not sure. I will see them focus more on the European project, as Biden and Blinken have both made comments in regards to Hungary and Austria, nations that have necessarily staved away from the European project. So I wouldn't be surprised that if we see sort of this the return to normalcy, as the establishment wants to call it.
Yeah, the return to kicking and screaming and doing taking covert political action until we get what we want out of these countries. It's a return to normalcy, right? I suspect that we're going to see, liberal interventionism return. These people, Antony Blinken or whatever his name is, Blinken, just back to the same old. And I had a debate with somebody. We were talking about it, and he was telling me that Joe Biden's going to be a new leader in the realm of foreign policy, that he's really going to do the progressive mandate and listen to the progressive voters. And I am baffled at the ability of someone to even believe that, given the nature of Washington. And you hear it time and time again, but there hasn't been a president that hasn't started a new conflict since Carter. And before that, it was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And now it's Trump. And, what happened to Carter? He was kicked out of office. What happened to Trump? Well, he was kicked out of office, essentially. And this regime that is in place, it's so powerful, and it's ready to roll. And a good example of this is the first 7 days in office, Trump did 5 executive orders. The first 5 days in office for Biden, he did 30. They've been established. They're playing on the home court, and I think this is really a place where Joe Biden is going to take the worst aspects of the Obama administration and add nothing of substance. That is America first. It's just going to be more of, and like I've already said, the same old.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, keep in mind that Biden did probably the one thing that Trump didn't do, which killed his administration, was Biden cleaned house in these first few days already, and was preparing to clean house since the election, because virtually, really? Well, I mean, he's got his people in place. They're former Obama admin officials. These are people who know how to run these bureaucratic offices. He's not going to do anything about the holdouts. He put that National Security Council advisor, who was a Trump administration appointee, on administrative leave. So doing all the things that you need to do to make sure that everything is in lockstep to get your ball rolling is essential. Now, there's a great video, and this ties in, I think, when we're talking about Europe and we're talking about liberal interventionism, because that is coming back. There's a great video from Peter Hitchens discussing what took place in Ukraine back in 2014 and 2015. And he talks about how the United States was heavily involved and essentially, through the CIA, mandated a color revolution to oust President Viktor Yanukovych out of office and have him take refuge in Russia. I would not be surprised if you see such an action take place in places like Belarus, places like Hungary, and places like Poland. Because even though the United States and Poland are improving their relationships under the Trump administration, we have a military base there now, I would not be surprised if the Biden administration works in conjunction with Brussels and the EU to place more pressure on them in the name of human rights and liberal democracy. That is an inevitability, I think, when we talk about when we talk about Blinken and we talk about Biden wanting to make diplomacy front and center of foreign policy, because let's face it, foreign policy in terms of diplomacy, especially in the United States, is usually some kind of pressured or coercive kind of application of force, usually through political and monetary means, not necessarily by force. Usually that's a last resort.
Well, in a way, it is forceful. I was listening to an interview with Blinken last night, which was a horrible way to end my day, from 5 years ago when he was still the assistant deputy. He was with the, I can't remember the name of the institution, but one of these think tanks or whatnot, liberal. And he was talking about that, exactly. He was talking about how the Obama administration, and like I said, it was 5 years ago, so he was thinking for the future. And he was saying the next Democrat administration planned on intervention, economic. Obviously, they use Newspeak. They use the words humanitarian efforts or and financial aid. But there was a caveat, of course, and he said the caveat was if they practice the Democrat principles, human rights. So what you were saying exactly, I mean, there is going to be pressure from the UN and from the European Union and any power structure that is controlled by the internationalists that want, I guess, globalism to reign supreme. So yeah, I mean, we should totally expect that. I mean, that's Blinken himself. He said that 5 years ago. He was still the assistant deputy or secretary deputy or whatever, and I, like I said, just carrying over the same thing.
Yeah,
and I think that with the increased instability because of COVID, the economic instability that we might see under the Biden administration, December jobs reports was bad. Consumer confidence is down. We're dealing with something that's a little bit new, to say the least, here with the lockdowns. And I know we're kind of opening up now because obviously the political effect is gone away with. But if we do see that economic instability, things will only get worse worldwide. I'm thinking sub-Saharan Africa because of COVID. I'm thinking Southeast Asia because of COVID. Economic instability in South America and in the Central Americas. And that affects trade, that affects our relations with all of these countries. And I don't know, truthfully, I don't know if the European Union at this moment could survive another worldwide economic crash.
Well, the economy is fragile as it is, and I think what is going to come in the months ahead is going to really determine whether or not the bubble pops, so to speak. Because as you've noticed I think someone had pointed it out on Twitter as well, that almost 75% or anywhere in that ballpark of the American money supply has been printed in the last 10 years or so. Like, that is an unfeasible situation. And that'll eventually come back to bite us in the ass. Whether or not when it happens is going to be a question of debate. But to not stray too far off topic, you're absolutely right, is that you're seeing a return sort of the Wilsonian idealism that has been embodied in sort of establishment Democrat foreign policy. And I don't think that Corona is going to play too much of an impact on the economies in other areas, such as West Africa or the tropics, as Jonathan points out in the chat. What you will see, however, is going to be a game of investment and foreign direct investment. And I think this plays in very nicely with trade and foreign policy, is that the United States structurally is a hard power dealing with a soft power conflict with the Chinese in terms of rivalry. And what do I mean by this is that the United States has reliably, for the last 70 years, effectively been relying on its military power to enforce global trade and economic imbalances across the globe. Without the American Navy, the global trade routes that we reap the benefits of today do not exist, and our standard of living would collapse overnight. Now, this does not mean, however, that the United States is impenetrable or invulnerable to outside intervention or outside engagement from other powers. This is in regards to the Chinese. Because the Chinese have been involving themselves more and more in things such as their Silk Road initiatives, building up foreign infrastructure banks in foreign countries, getting direct investment in other nations. And that, of course, is a direct challenge to the American interests abroad. And that's where we're at. Now, what this all means is that the United States is going to have to either A, play catch up, or B, try to regain some sort of institutional control away from the Chinese. But I think anyone who's been paying attention to what China's been doing knows that that's going to be a Herculean task in and of itself. And I sincerely doubt that this administration is capable of doing so. People are always wondering, like, how did China become such a gigantic threat or a concern? And it's not that they haven't been for some time. If you were to go back 6 years ago, the Chinese government, and it's a report authored by Xi Jinping's office, discussed the sort of the state of the Chinese and discuss what China plans to do moving forward, which is greater integration into international institutions, develop an alternative, system of trade and politics outside of the United States where it is Chinese oriented and centric. And that's where we're at. And for some reason, I feel like the foreign policy establishment of the United States thoroughly ignored this report and thoroughly ignored this I think it's about 500 some odd pages. I have a copy of it in storage, of what the Chinese were planning on doing. And so here we are now, 6 years later, and you have a global crisis that is partially self-inflicted from Corona, to where institutions are having more and more influence from the Chinese. The nations with the largest amount for growth, both in population and economic growth, such as Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, are rapidly ceding ground to the Chinese and economic infrastructure. So it is going to be a very difficult task for the United States in a long time. And yes, they have been talking about China as a problem since they intervened in the Korean War, Jonathan. But I'm referring more to, since the 90s, you had that debate about whether or not Chinese market liberalization would either democratize China or it would lead to more concentration of political power and more centralization. Obviously, the latter has taken place rather than the former. And I think the establishment still holds on to the idea that cooperation is something that can happen instead of rivalry, which, I mean, as I've said in the past in live streams, I'm a big proponent of power transition theory by AFK Orgnosky. To me, it's just the likelihood of having some sort of economic and military cooperation with a power that sees the United States as an intrinsic threat to its sovereignty, both culturally and historically, makes it highly unlikely that you're going to find a diplomatic solution in the immediate future. And I hope that I'm wrong, but based on my understanding of foreign policy reading and theory, that it's just not going to happen. And that was a long rant. I'm sorry there, DC.
Oh no, that's entirely okay. I like the monologues. The thing about this, and to just kind of like ladder off what you were saying, China, there's no diplomatic solution, etc. Under President Trump, I think China was aware of that. I think Trump was aware of that. I think that he was much more willing to fight them if they. I think he was much more willing to fight them if they did try anything. And now it's been, the first week of the Biden administration. What have they done? They've flown in Taiwanese airspace. They've attacked India. And now Xi Jinping has straight up come out and said at the Davos convention, speaking about this Cold War could go hot. Now, I know that's not the exact quote, but that's the gist of what he was saying. And what has the Biden response been? What have they done? They haven't issued a statement, I don't think. We have rumors coming out of Politico and CNN or one or the other talking about how Hunter Biden pressured his father to not escalate with China, to not even mention the Taiwanese airspace intrusion. And I know me and you have been speaking about this back and forth a little bit, how it might just be posturing, but also that was only after one of these events. Now we've had two more instances of escalation. And the question is, will Biden allow them to get away with this? Will Biden just sit down? Will he leave the table? Will he morally abdicate the ground that we have held onto for the last 100 years as the world leader? And that's the real question. That's the real test. And I think that might be the theme of the next 4 years, or maybe the next 8 years, in this administration.
The Xi Jinping statement at Davos, and I have his statements actually in front of me here from France 24. The all-virtual Davos forum on Monday, stating that warned against a new Cold War and urged global unity in the face of the coronavirus pandemic, having largely curbed the spread within the pandemic within its borders, which we know that's not true.
Supposedly.
Supposedly. Xi wants to position China as a key player in a multilateral world order as the U.S. remains crippled by the pandemic. To build small cliques or to start a new Cold War, to reject, threaten, or intimidate others will only push the world into division, Xi said in a likely veiled attack on U.S. President Joe Biden's plans to revitalize global alliances to counter China's growing influence. He states that confrontation will always end up harming every nation's interests and sacrificing people's welfare. Now, as you may have heard, the United States is sending a carrier group towards Taiwan in response to the invasion of Taiwanese airspace. The Germans are sending a naval carrier group there as well. And I think that this is going to be more or less a standoff. I don't see an escalation of I don't see the conflict becoming kinetic. What I will most likely see, however, is a return of the Obama administration's policy of freedom of navigation operations, also known as FONOPs. These were United States naval vessels through international maritime law would simply address freedom to navigate through in territorial waters, which allowed the United States to essentially spy on artificial islands and Chinese naval projects within the South China Sea. I would not be surprised if we see a return of that, and you'll see more and more sort of sniping where we'll play a game of chicken both with the Navy and through aircraft and UAVs spying on one another over the sea. Let me respond to someone, Dan here in chat. Do you put any stock in the idea that China is a paper tiger and will collapse economically? Actually, I do. And the reason why I put stock in that concept is because demographics. The last I read, China has somewhere of a population of about 385 million people over the age of 65. China does not have the social security apparatus and the safety nets that a lot of Western nations do in taking care of the elderly. You have a huge cultural dependence on the idea of the youth taking care of the elderly, which puts a strain on the economy because you have to work harder, take away resources, you're not contributing. So there's that issue. I do think it may have a significant impact on the ability for the country to maintain its economic posturing, which is why I think, however, they're doing it through other means, such as through trade agreements, the Silk Road initiatives, and investing in other areas. Because even if you're not doing so well domestically, you can keep your economy propped up through returns from loans and infrastructure projects, which we're seeing through infrastructure banks and investment in other countries. So it potentially there's a paper tiger on the demography sense, but I think that China's well enough aware of that they're taking care of it through other means of financial and political infrastructure abroad.
Well, I think
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, answer Melphus, or address that comment. I know that is what you were going to do.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Economic freedoms equal democracy is a false premise anyway. If economic freedom would have led to democracy, then monarchies would have never formed in history. Yeah, I agree. I think that this is sort of the hubris, I think, of sort of neoliberal economic thinking, is that, the classic trope of two countries with a McDonald's inside of it never go to war with one another. And that's not true, because we're always politics is just war by another means, and we're always politically engaged with countries that do have McDonald's inside of their borders. We constantly battle with the French, we constantly battle with the Germans. I mean,
we've also had open conflict with, and this is something that Huntington wrote about. We had open conflict in the Balkans. They had McDonald's. That's happened. We've gone that saying is bunk now. Very
true. And Huntington is actually on my reading list, and that'll be a part of the book club streams that I do throughout 2021. So I will probably have you on for that. And their demographics are messed up, Dan, which is why I think it may or may not play an impact on how well they can project power. I know that they have abandoned the one-child policy almost 10 years ago. I don't know how much of an impact that's had. But again, you also have that massive problem of just transporting populations inside the country from rural areas into these prefabricated, almost built overnight cities, and engaging in sort of these managerial office type jobs and occupations that both, one, the populations aren't well equipped for, both technically and educationally, and then two, they're positions that usually are outsourced jobs or, invested in, that have little to no impact on international trade to promote, the Chinese productivity. But I mean, it's its own separate mess. And whether or not the current admin is going to do anything about that is beyond me. I know that Blinken has made public statements saying that the Trump administration was right in its approach towards China in terms of being tough on them, dealing with the trade imbalances, and to discuss how to handle the theft of intellectual property. So despite the fact that Biden more or less may have his own issues politically with the Chinese, we do see Blinken and others acknowledging that China's strategic position is stronger than the United States at every key metric. And that's something that even Blinken has said in a statement, according to Reuters. They want to bring back these alliances, and I'm curious to see what that will fully entail. And I know that entails the Europeans being more involved. However, I think what is important is that we discuss the return of existing infrastructure. So one of the things that the United States has had in terms of soft power in the area, which is not something that the U.S. excels at, but it's something that we need to spend more time on, I think, if we're going to engage in this game of nations and hegemony, is that it is called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. It includes a variety of Southeast Asian states. I believe the Philippines, Japan, Australia, and a few others are a part of that list, which helps to facilitate trade discussion and investment in all of their countries. Now, that means that, I mean, lately, during the end of the Obama administration, as well as during the Trump administration, a lot of the association nations were drifting towards the Chinese. Duterte drifted heavily towards China, as well as seeing the United States just not put as much emphasis on this infrastructure network while it tries to negotiate trade agreements with the Chinese and deal with its trade war. However, I think that if Blinken is going to pursue an alliance-based approach and trying to either contain or to, be on equal footing to the Chinese, you're going to need to ensure that you have regional partnerships. And that includes the Australians and that includes the Japanese, which have historically been American partners in the area, although the domestic internal politics of Australia definitely make it difficult because they are not as friendly to us as we used to be, and the same goes for Japan. But I am curious to see what Blinken will put out in terms of what he means by alliances. I would expect that there will be more goodwill tours towards Vietnam, towards South Korea, and other partnered countries that we have in the area. I would expect that Blinken will pursue trade agreements. That's why he hasn't necessarily taken the Trans-Pacific Partnership off the table. It is only a matter of time, I think, until post-confirmation of Blinken of what will happen next.
Right, and we're definitely going to have to get back together and talk more foreign policy in the future, just chronicle, or I guess document the development over the next, 24 months to 4 years or whatever. And the alliances is a prospect, and I'm glad you brought up Australia, which is economically tied to China more than ever, which, I feel like China pulls a lot more levers in Australia than the West lets on. If you listen to China Uncensored, which is obviously not an unbiased source, but they do some pretty decent reporting on the ties that China has to Australia, and so does the Epoch Times, which is also not an unbiased source. They're very anti-China, which is, partly why they're good on this stuff, because every other publication is bought out by China. China buys whole pages in Washington Post, New York Times, promote what it is they're doing to paint them in the good light. And going back to the paper thing I read today, and I didn't dive into it because more than whatever. I read that China has now overtaken safe foreign investments. Did you see that?
Say that again. You had cut out there.
Has overtaken the USA in foreign investments.
No, but that does. I hadn't read that. No, if you could send that to me, I'd love to read that. Yeah. But on the question of alliances, I think that what we're going to see is the United States pivot and try and renew its diplomatic and economic relations with the Australians, simply because the Chinese and the Australians recently have been fighting inside the WTO. And there have been about 14 complaints since November of last year that the Chinese have levied against the Australians, such as foreign interference legislation viewed as targeting China in the absence of any evidence, incessant wanton interference in China's Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan affairs, spearheading a crusade against China in certain multilateral forms, the first non-littoral country to make a statement on the South China Sea to the United Nations, siding with the United States' anti-China campaign and spreading disinformation imported from the U.S. around China's efforts containing COVID-19. The latest legislation to scrutinize agreements with a foreign government targeting towards China, aiming to torpedo the Victorian participation in BNR, and provided funding to anti-China think tanks for spreading untrue reports, peddling lies around Xinjiang, and the so-called Chinese infiltration aimed at manipulating public opinion against China. Those are just a few of the complaints that have been levied diplomatically against the Australian government. So I do see that we're going to have that focus on alliances definitely rely heavily on Australia in the near future.
If I'm not mistaken, I do recall hearing about a specific in my bunk idea, but they might pursue this to counter China the same way NATO countered the Soviet Union. I think Japan or South Korea has been leveraging to join NATO, and this web of alliances. I'm against alliances. I think that whatever, who cares? But we're talking about Biden, and I think that this is the path that they'll be putting, like you, South Korea, in these Western, I guess, Asian countries. I don't know if Philippines is really all that primed for it, seeing as how they have a strong man as a leader who probably gets along with Xi more than he does with Biden.
Well, I'm inclined to agree that with the Philippines, you're going to see that continued shift away from the United States' sphere of influence to the Chinese. And that happened under the Trump administration, and I would expect it to fully continue now, particularly towards the rejection of American arms sales. And that's happened under Trump, and I would expect that to continue under this administration. The other thing to consider also is in terms of alliances, is that one, alliances are necessary based on how U.S. grand strategy works. We talked about this last time in regards to the concepts laid out by George Friedman in The Next 100 Years about maintaining domination of the seas for global trade, preventing the creation of a state or coalition of states from challenging U.S. supremacy, and creating a network of alliances to maintain its sphere of influence globally. Now, as the alliance-oriented strategy seems to be the case with Blinken and Biden right now, I would expect that nations like Australia and nations like India are going to be very important in the future in regards to those alliances encountering China. Now, the Chinese and the Indians have recently signed a series of border agreements regarding border security. They have had clashes in the past few years. The United States foreign policy establishment and infrastructure has put a lot of attention on India, just both for goodwill reasons, right? Like, the United States is partnering with the world's largest democracy. The United States is partnering with, one of the BRIC countries, which are claimed to be future hegemonic powers in the future. BRIC being, of course, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Right. So there is an infrastructure in place. Now, whether or not it will be successful is entirely dependent upon the approaches that the United States put in. And I think that's going to be essential towards the areas of trade, the facilitation of security technology, both in information technology as well as actual kinetic technology and weapons, as well as cooperation in intelligence sharing. Now, those are going to be the three major things I would fully expect Blinken to put his focus on, especially because Biden has put a career diplomat as the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. So I would not be surprised if you see an increased level of coordination between the CIA and the American State Department on a diplomatic front. Now, this does not mean it's going to be diplomacy in the traditional sense. It will be American coercive pressure through other means, right, because we're working with an intelligence apparatus. but I would not be surprised in the slightest to see an increased cooperation of the CIA and the State Department from Blinken and Biden's nominee to the CIA. To me, it makes too much sense to not do that, especially when you're trying to pursue a multilateral state approach in countering the largest hegemonic threat to American economic and strategic supremacy. And that's what I.
Okay, so what do you propose is the right move then?
See, now you're asking me to give suggestions to Joe Biden, and he's not going to listen. And this is where I'm brutally reminded of Academic Agent's 15 lessons about engaging in low politics. But
which
see, this is this is low politics, right? But at the same time,
exactly, that's what this is.
But at the same time, you can't escape foreign policy. I live in the middle of nowhere in flyover country, but foreign policy of administration is still going to affect me. It's still going to affect, my cost of living, whether it's with gas or the price of food. So, I mean, it's important. Melphis says, so the CIA back to assassinating politicians and millionaires again, eh? It never stopped.
Yeah.
We just instead of assassinating them, it really didn't. Instead of just assassinating, we have conveniently just propped up new leaders such as Navalny in Russia, because he has been called everything from a white nationalist who supports Black Lives Matter here in the United States. Like, if you ever needed someone to glow harder and be more astroturfed than an NFL field, he's your guy. So it's not the
African immigrant in Russia. Black. How many black people are in Russia?
Not many.
Like, it's got to be
less than 5%.
About 50,000 Afro-Russians in 2009, and that's how you know that he's backed by the West, is that he's vocally on the side. And this is what you were just saying. I'm just reiterating it because it's true. I mean, these people are they're astroturf. They're paid for. They're promoted. They're politically trained by, I guess, the current political establishment that's been in place in Washington. We've been doing this forever.
Yeah, we have been. But to go back to what you were asking, this is low politics. But however, like I had said, you can't escape foreign policy. And my philosophical position, even though my politics in the last year or so have trended more and more towards the neo-reactionary crowd, is that I still firmly wish to enjoy the quality of life that American hegemony provides. I just hate the ideology I live under. That's why I like Darren Beatty's description of sort of the American empire as the GAE, the big gay. Because we do live under the big gay, because I'm an immature 25-year-old. And the big gay is a problem because it's ideology I can't fucking stand. And I would love to see it changed. Someone had pointed out, I don't know if it was Prog Rock Farmer or Zero HP Lovecraft on Twitter, but someone was saying the Cold War ending was such a tragedy because the Cold War had forced America culturally, at least nominally, to be on the right. And once the Soviet Union fell, it had no reason to be on the right side of anything politically. And I think that that's a really good analysis. And that's where we're at. And so I would love for it to go back to that. And I don't like the idea of invoking Cold War language, or even George W. Bush invoking World War II language with the axis of evil when discussing American threats to hegemony, because I don't think you need to do that. I think that if the Biden administration is actually genuinely concerned from its concerns on the campaign trail about putting America first in terms of buying American and American manufacturing, then you need to pursue, at the very least, of what Steve Bannon had outlined in 2016 and 2017, which was you're not decoupling from China, but necessarily divesting infrastructure, manufacturing infrastructure out of the Chinese territory. Doing so in India, doing so in the United States, and promulgating a tax and trade policy that would encourage American companies to shore back on. Now, of course, there are going to be companies that will utilize their tax code, such as Ireland, to bring in capital and to bring in the base of operations of other companies, which will always be a problem. But if you're going to try your best to maintain American hegemony, One, I mean, I would love to change the ideology we operate under. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But for this administration to do any nominal amount of good would have to significantly increase the confrontations with the Chinese. You still have the national security threat of America's energy infrastructure and its information technology and intellectual property being stolen, which again, we have Biden signing that ridiculous executive order allowing the Chinese to work within the American energy grid. That is a huge vulnerability. I don't know why the hell they're doing that. That needs to go, but it's not going to.
Yeah.
I would scratch that day one. Second, I would increase my diplomatic and economic relations with India and Australia to ensure that they're not alone and that they have American weight and American treasure and muscle backing them on their trade disputes and agreements. And then finally, I would be coordinating with the French to increase American investment, both financially in terms of humanitarian aid, as well as counterterrorism efforts in Africa. Because Africa is going to be one of the largest economic centers and population centers by 2100. So we're going to have to deal with them eventually. Now, however, the things that make, and this allows us, I think, to transition a bit away from trade into Africa, is that the United States in December of 2019 passed the Global Fragility Act. And it is meant to be a way to reduce and prevent violent conflict. It is meant to create a comprehensive U.S. strategy in how we spend foreign aid and how we spend military aid in reducing the likelihood that we create conflict in the area. Now, prior to Trump leaving office, there was supposed to be a report put out in December about nations that we're going to start targeting through the Global Fragility Act to reduce the likelihood of conflict in those areas in internal affairs. However, it hasn't been put out yet from the last I checked. But the GFA is meant to reduce national security agencies' bureaucratic sort of red tape and to create tailored plans for 18 priority countries to discuss how we can reduce violence and improve the quality of life, such as good governance, justice reform, civilian security, peace processes. It's very vague in its essence because there hasn't been anything put out yet. But that is one of the newest things, foreign policy-wise, that this administration is going to have to deal with.
Well, that just indicates to me, I mean, it being so vague, it being so broad, I mean, it's just going to be another cash flow, money cow or whatever, I guess, to fund Western global homo in these African nations. I don't see it any other way. And if that means American, supremacy worldwide, then I guess, is it really worth it? Is the real question. Do you think that that's what it is? It's just going to be an excuse to export our culture, which is really, not existent, but the lack of culture?
Well, I mean, it depends entirely on the countries that are selected within this report or within this piece of legislation. But the other thing is that it's not going to just be African countries. It will be areas such as Kazakhstan and nations within the Mideast that are normally not addressed. So it just, again, the issue with Congress that has always been with foreign policy and with any domestic policy as well is that the United States Congress writes shell policy.
Right.
And from there, relies on the civil service and its administrative heads to do the work and to create the laws, or how the law will be administered. So it's not like they're ever fully put into implementation from Congress themselves.
Yeah. Abdicating their power, their responsibilities is a smart way to avoid getting blamed for any problems, right? The worry I have, though, is with Kazakhstan and everything, and I've read a long time ago basically saying that, talking about this initiative that they're doing. is it really a good thing that we're going to get involved in places that maybe we don't need to be, like Kazakhstan? I mean, what's going on in Kazakhstan that really requires our immediate attention?
Sure. And I mean, here's what I don't know I don't know if you're old enough to remember Herman Cain on the campaign trail in 2008. Where he, oh, well, okay. There's a famous interview that you should look up. And he's talking about foreign policy, and Herman Cain just goes, "I don't need to know what's going on in Uzbekistan to care about what's happening in the United States." And that sentiment, I still think, rings true a lot, especially for those in the more paleo-conservative vein of American politics. But yeah,
what you meant to say was the correct vein of American politics.
The correct. Well, yeah.
Hubris, right?
Buchanan was right, but we ignored him, and now we're reaping the consequences.
Mm-hmm. And that's the most upsetting thing about reading Buchanan, is realizing I think he said in 2004 and before was incredibly correct, and I'm sure what he said afterwards, I don't know why I stopped at 2004, because that's when he wrote the Where the Right Went Wrong, which really just talks a lot about this, or a state, not an empire, or whatever.
Yeah,
very good
and
books.
I mean,
and it's awful reading his books now, because it's like, well, he was right about everything up to this point, and he talks about how things are going to get even worse. So, I mean, why won't he be correct in the future? Which is pretty upsetting, because it means he's been right thus far. His prediction is that things will probably get worse. If he's been correct, that means he's probably right. Things are probably going to get much worse, which is, but the way I look at it is, if things do get worse on the world stage, and it's already happening with union workers, it's already happening with a lot of these academic types, college-educated types that were like, if I had known Joe Biden was going to put us back in lockdown, I would never have voted for him. It's like, oh, okay. It's like, well, now you know. Okay, now you know what you're dealing with. And so I think that every time Joe Biden makes a mistake, every time we invade a Middle Eastern country, it's red-pilling more people. It's moving people even further right, maybe not red-pilling them, because being red-pilled takes a lot more than just realizing that Democrats are bad, but that's the way I look at it. And so I do have a lot of hope, regardless of what Buchanan says. Anyways, sorry for that diatribe.
You're good. Buchanan's been right since the 90s, but don't worry about it. Melphis says, in Kazakhstan, it is within Russian and Chinese sphere of influence, and it is a strategic location when it comes to Russia's national security. Yes, not to mention that it also has, last I checked, some strategic oil reserves, as well as some rare earth minerals that the Russians rely on. So it would play a role in getting involved. It's purely to undermine the Russian strategic position. And as I've discussed in the past, that I think the biggest mistake the United States foreign policy ever made was that post-fall of the Soviet Union, the United States did not do more to diplomatically build up and integrate with the Russians and create them as their own regional hegemonic power. We lied to the Russians when we said that we wouldn't get NATO pretty much on its borders. We did that. We have pushed for the last 10 years to get more and more former Soviet republics inside the European project, which of course Russia will perceive as a threat to its sovereignty. We are currently propping up a fake opposition leader that gets arrested every time he enters the country and has been poisoned inside Russia's country. So we abandoned the likelihood of having a strategic nuclear armed state that would be aligned in American and Western influences, or at least their interest, against the coming rise of China. And that, I think, will be a problem that will continue to bite us in the ass for decades to come. But as we talk about...
In Russia was a valuable ally against China. That was blundered. But yes, continue.
Oh, well, and I mean, but this return to normalcy business that everyone keeps praising, like I said, it's messianic politics and I can't stand it, but that's the nature of our media, who has bought the knee guards and has assumed the position of sucking off the state. And
oh god,
I mean, it's true.
Yeah, it's true.
the Telegraph article thing I sent you yesterday, where President Biden must revive the Gulf War spirit if he is to reunite a divided West. America's new commander-in-chief can take inspiration from the international force that liberated Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. And like I said, we've been bombing Iraq and parts of the Middle East almost nonstop for the last 30 years. It's kind of depressing.
Yeah, people forget about Operation Fox, which was a Bill Clinton just bombing campaign against Saddam, which practically took out all of his nuclear capabilities. And we talked about this last time. It's like this never-ending bombing. Of course, these people hate us. I would hate us if I was them. I mean, we're kind of not the good guys in this situation when we're blowing up Iraq for 30 years straight. And I know that's a tough pill to swallow. It's like, wait a minute. And I know it's a tough pill to swallow because you're a military brat. You say it. I am too. My father was, military. I grew up in a military town. And it sucks to acknowledge the fact that, yeah, we might be the baddies in a lot of these situations. And Saddam Hussein was no angel, nor is Bashar al-Assad. But does evil justify evil in return? I guess that's something I'll leave between like whoever's listening and their God. But my personal opinion is very obvious on this stuff.
Well, and here's the thing, is that we have the last 8 years of Obama's foreign policy to give us a really good insight as to what is going to happen in this one. And again, we are going to see, I do fear, because we've put more American troops back into Syria. We have recently and conveniently seen a bombing inside Baghdad in Iraq, and the so-called claims that it was from the Islamic State, despite virtually being destroyed from the Trump administration after the rules of engagement changed. So we're going to see a renewed engagement in the area. Now, will the United States pursue... Well, Biden will most likely pursue another push to topple Assad, because the United States and the establishment foreign policy is coming back to the idea that the Arab Spring is still alive and well, and we can continue that spirit. Although the only country to have a meaningful Arab Spring, quote unquote, is Tunisia, and even then its democracy is barely alive. And as Gabe Marcus points out, people are fooled into thinking that we can impose Western culture on the East. Newsflash, we can't, and I absolutely agree.
It's so true.
Wholeheartedly agree. Thank you, Gabe. Good comment there. But we're going to see more of that, and we're going to see sort of this return of facilitating arms sales to rebel groups that will most likely be terrorists in the next generation against the United States. History is going to be repeating itself in a lot of ways. And even though Biden has only been in office for 5 days, the fact that we have essentially put the entire national security and foreign policy leadership of former Obama administration and former people of his vice presidential, office tells us that we are returning to the idea of sanction, intervention, naming and shaming kind of foreign policy that was lambasted by a lot of foreign policy conservatives who were within the Beltway, saying that all that it did was reduce America's influence abroad and tell the leadership that we are not reliable to help our allies and its needs. And what we're going to see in the Middle East because of that, I think, is going to significantly be dependent upon how much Biden's foreign policy team and Blinken will do to honor the peace agreements that the Trump administration put out. Because the Trump administration's logic, how I understand it, was this, is that you move the embassy to Jerusalem, you tell pretty much all these Arab states that hate Israel, listen, we're not moving the embassy, this is how we're recognizing it, the idea of a two-state solution is dead, so either play ball or fuck off. And they decided to play ball, that's where we get these agreements. Whether or not that happens under this administration remains to be seen. I know that Israel gave Biden a lot of shit within 2 days when they had changed the Twitter account for the U.S. Embassy to Israel to include the Gaza Strip and parts of Palestine. Yeah. And that Twitter handle quickly changed after an angry phone call from Netanyahu. So I think...
Is that true? He didn't call him, did he?
There was a phone call. I don't know if it was Netanyahu himself, but there was a phone call from the Israelis.
Spicy.
Well, I'm not surprised in the slightest.
Oh, neither am I, of course. Or probably someone from AIPAC.
Well, that's a can of worms that we can spend a whole other stream on.
I've read the book,
but yeah, but we can what we can infer though, however, right? Because Israel views anything as an existential threat to itself. So I'm not surprised that they made that phone call. However, I think that what that is indicative of, however, is that the United States under this new administration will probably do its best to maintain those peace agreements. So you will see coalition building in the Middle East, whether or not this means that we're going to use multilateral pressure from, say, Saudi Arabia, from Jordan, from other nations in the area to topple Assad or to renew military engagements. That remains to be seen if they get other nations involved. But the United States will utilize its influence there and will work with the Israelis to continue bombing the Middle East. And it doesn't help that Israel has basing rights in nations like Azerbaijan, which means that they have quicker access to Iranian airspace. They have quicker access to Syrian airspace. So I would expect, now that the American military has committed more forces into the region again, that we will see probably an increased likelihood of more kinetic confrontations with Assad's forces and other terror groups in the area, which of course will cause more spillover, which will cause more tensions and more immigration out of the Middle East. And that will, all of that does is strengthen Turkey, which of course puts more tension between Turkey and the EU. And now that, the US is back, quote unquote, I think that you're going to see another migrant crisis take place out of the Middle East into Europe once more.
Yeah, and this goes back to our pessimism that Mrs. Franco was talking about. And it's true. It has literally only been 5 days. But also, if you've been here the whole time, you know that we keep hearkening back to the Obama administration. We had 8 years of this already. And to assume that things are going to change is foolish. And I hate the fact, I was thinking about it while you were speaking there. It's like, of course things should change. Donald Trump was proven himself successful in the world of foreign policy. But I had to remind myself that success does not indicate replication in Washington, D.C. Just because something works well doesn't mean that they're going to do it. Even if it's proven to work well. Actually, it probably means they're not going to do it if it works well. Why would they? So yes, pessimistic, guilty as charged, but I don't see how you're not at this point in regard to things. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I am pretty hopeful that things work out. And I'm white-pilled, man. I'm always white-pilled. So there's that. Just to kind of rebuke that charge of pessimism, it's like you can be optimistically pessimist, I guess, or pessimistic, I guess. And that's where I'm at.
Yeah, and as I had said in my most recent video, I think that there are those that I disagree with in terms who are accelerationists, but I think that this is going to move things rather rapidly, and this may either bring about the collapse of the current, foreign policy establishment and infrastructure, although I sincerely doubt it, but one can be hopeful. Or right. B, you're going to see the unintended consequences and sort of the integral accident take place of this foreign policy. And we'll deal with the consequences, but I think it will bring about change in our internal politics as to how we address things. But Dan says, couldn't it be a good thing that Russia was sidelined? Every country that ends up going into an alliance with the United States ends up getting subverted. And that's probably the silver lining to it, is that while Russia's on its own, pursuing its own interests and is closer to China than it is with us, they are definitely not as influenced culturally or economically by the, current regime. The big gay. The big
global
gay.
Homo.
Global homo.
The global American empire.
Yeah. Raging Mandrill says, but how? And I want to know what you mean. How, in what context?
What are you referring to?
Yeah, what were you referring to? I'd love to answer your question, though. But yeah, and so as we get more involved in the Middle East again in the name of counterterrorism and American security, all of that sort of George W. Bush leftism about being anti-war, I think, is going to go away again, just like it went away for most of the American left when Obama was in office. Because anytime a Democrat is in office, the anti-war left suddenly disappears. They have this really weird invisibility cloak where they just don't exist anymore. So the American right will once again be the anti-war guys.
Yeah, and there's some consistent people. Kyle Kalinske comes to mind on the left, but like people like Sam Cedar or what's that? Those other guys at the Young Turks. They are, supposed anti-war leftists, but they're really embarrassing. And I was talking before we went live, and it's like a lot of the sources that you have to come up with on the mainstream are liberal for anti-war stuff, and even them they're pushed out of the mainstream by neoliberals, and so it is really like just us alone in this fight to push back against the gay.
Oh, so Raging Mandrill says, how are you still how are you still white pilled?
How am I still white pilled? Well, I am, first of all, I believe in Christ, so ultimate redemption at the end of the day, which is the, I don't put my hopes in the flesh, but in the things that focus on the heavenly realm. So there's that. But also, I mean, like I said, I'm not an accelerationist, but at what point do you just go, okay, I'm going to embrace the accelerationism, right? We're already here. Why not just go with it? And so that's the way I look at it. And I see the movements that are popping up. I see the boomers waking up. And I know it's kind of a meme, the boomer waffen, but my mother and father are boomers, and I've seen them activate. And it's amazing, and it's something that I would never think it happens, and they're receptive to my ideas, because I talk to my parents about politics a lot, and thankfully enough they respect me enough to actually listen. And because of that, I've been telling them about Dan Crenshaw and Nikki Haley and really what's going on in the world. And my mom came in here memeing about the Bernie Sanders thing, and I was like, Mom, that's not funny. She was like, I think it's funny. And I was like, well, it's just what the, and I use the term cathedral. It's what the cathedral is propping up to distract us from everything that's going on. And she was like, yeah, I guess you're right. And I was like, uh-huh. And like that stuff, they're becoming receptive to this dialogue. Put your faith in not in God, but in gunpowder. I mean, that's fair enough.
That's what I call Fed posting.
Right. But yeah, I mean, I'm seeing the dialogue change, and I posted this on Twitter as well. In the matter of 365 days, the discourse on the conservative right went from capitalism versus socialism to good versus evil, and I said that is a winning moral basis. So I'm seeing the ground shifting, and something that you say on your Monday morning or your Monday musings, you say that the Reconquista took 800 years, and obviously I don't have 800 years, but I have hope for the future, and maybe it's because I'm young and naive, but I'm just I'm an optimistic guy. I think that's fair.
Yeah, I'm there with you. My latest video is about 20 minutes of me trying to be white pilled. So I offer some reasons to it, but at the same time I'm pessimistic in that video where, to me, there is something intrinsically more honorable and more good about being in a last stand and a cause considered lost. So even if I'm losing, I'm going down with the ship.
Yes.
But Gabe Marcus says we must make the right the perpetual anti-war side. And yes, and I think you're seeing that because there are internal divisions inside the GOP. You have the outer party Bushites who would love to return to the party of Karl Rove and Dick Cheney. And notice how hard you have seen places like the National Review and the Federalist with their really shitty op-ed articles saying Liz Cheney is the future of the GOP. When
I can't believe it.
Half of the Republican conference inside the House of Representatives don't even fucking want her in the leadership.
More than half. I think the number of signatures on that private ballot has moved up to like 117 or something.
It's over 115 signatures.
Right.
But you're seeing this real hardcore push now that everything is back to the way it was. Everything is like 2012 all over again. And you are seeing the Republicans being like, well, it's time to go back to Mitt Romney because that's how we're regressing. And the internal divisions and conflict inside the Republican Party is a warm welcome to see a focus more on American workers and a focus more on less foreign intervention.
Totally.
And I love that every time Liz Cheney or fucking Meghan McCain talk on Twitter, the first thing that they talk about is how evil their fathers were. And
Well, and I do want to, the primary of Liz Cheney is epic. I think we're going to see that come out. But I saw a political article that compared Liz Cheney to Margaret Thatcher.
well, I mean,
and
they're
it
both
just
terrible.
it made my blood boil. I just couldn't believe it. But there's a comment here who says by Mark, who I like Mark on Twitter. I like your threads and stuff. He says the accelerationists never worked to our advantage, and I think that you're right. It hasn't. But I think that's a problem with defining accelerationist. Maybe I don't use it the correct way. But the way I look at accelerationism is people are waking up to how bad things are because things are getting worse. And as things get worse, they get pushed back to the wall, nowhere else to go except for towards American conservatism. Funnily enough, ever since the French Revolution, it's usually the left side of politics that's the more hawkish compared to the reactionaries. Ever since it's the left that's more hawkish. I kind of agree.
Yes, that's inherently true.
Yes, perhaps, but there was this huge anti-war push in the 60s and 70s towards Vietnam that really made the neoconservatives switch parties. We all know about this.
Well, yeah, and I mean, Mandrill points out rightly so that they're Trotskyites. They're not real right wingers.
Yes, they come from Trotskyism. I don't know if that necessarily. I haven't done enough research on the neoconservatives, to be honest, to really, diagnose them with the cancer of Trotskyism. But maybe, and if that is the case, that sucks. But it is true that they are pro market intervention, pro foreign intervention, and really not even socially conservative. So I don't know what is conservative about them other than, I guess, nothing.
Those were communists that were against fighting other communists during that era, were they not? Yes, they were. You had an entire, and that's the other thing, right? Is that our history that they teach in our public education of that era is very warped. And the first video I recommend to anybody who kind of wants a wake-up call to American history is to listen to Razor Fist's "Hollywood Was Always Red," and he breaks down how much money that the Soviets were putting into Hollywood at the time, how McCarthy was right on the money in targeting communist agitators and infiltrators inside Hollywood and the armed forces, and a lot of the socially progressive movements of the 60s. I mean, coming out of the Frankfurt School, coming out of the emerging theories of postmodernism at the time, of course, they were not going to be wanting to engage with other communists around the globe. Why would they want to engage in the foreign policy of communist containment? That was very much an underpinning aspect ideologically of the anti-war left at the time. It was definitely communists not wanting to fight other communists.
Okay. I've heard, I might be historically illiterate in this regard, but I've heard the opposite. The Trotskyites really hated Stalin and hated what he did to Russia and the plan that was developed. And so they wanted to basically get rid of Stalin, maybe not get rid of communism, but is there any truth to that?
Yes. I mean, I don't know how much of your early Soviet history you're aware of, but I mean, Trotsky was murdered.
Right.
There's a reason why the term ice pick has a lot of meaning in communist and leftist circles, is because Trotsky was murdered by an ice pick. And actually, that language was recently brought up in the Labour Party in the UK about a year ago, which is kind of terrifying to think about. McCarthy was wrong. He underestimated the extent of the problem. Yes, Mark, he certainly did. And Moldbug has a really good position on McCarthy, saying that McCarthy wasn't after communists. He was after the cathedral, and he suffered the consequences of challenging the cathedral in the way that he did. Raging Mandrill says, they followed the same pathway from the left to the right as Burnham, but only the thing that they took from the right wing is an overemphasis on character and military spending. Yes. NZ is
that's
obviously destined to rule the world. Are you familiar with the CIA funding of American leftist theorists and movements, etc.? Vaguely. I'm well aware that the CIA has poured money into, at least during the 60s and 70s, into a lot of American leftist movements and abroad, but I haven't done enough reading to really say I know concretely how much money, which theorists, the names. But I know that there is a significant connection between the two. But to get back on track, on questions of foreign policy and the Biden administration, there has been some.
Oh yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's what we were originally talking about. Yeah. So within the first few days of this administration, on his first day of office, Joe Biden repealed the Trump administration's 2017 immigration restriction, also known as the Muslim ban, on travel and visas from predominantly Muslim countries. The list grew to include 13 nations, which included Somalia, Nigeria, Sudan, Eritrea, Egypt, Libya, and Tanzania. So not only was that taken off, and I would imagine that we'll probably see more a resuming of American refugee and asylum policies from those countries. But we're also going to see probably a more engaged United States, specifically within U.S. AFRICOM in terms of national security. We will probably work closer to deal with groups such as Boko Haram and others. And of course, the emphasis in the United States foreign policy establishment, of course, is going to be on gender equality. And that is always that's been sort of the main talking point from the United States in terms of African policy has been women's education. I mean, we saw it with hashtag Bring Back Our Girls with the Obama administration. There's been a lot of writing and a lot of literature put out there. Ironically enough, they've done a lot to bring a lot of them home, but not with a lot of American influence. But the thing is that you're going to see a lot of focus, I think, mainly on gender education and sort of the soft, quote unquote, aspects of American foreign aid. And there's been a lot of literature in the foreign policy establishment in the United States that says that we need to start looking at foreign policy and national security as a feminist issue, because they argue that nations inside sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East that have, sort of these polygamous policies of bride pricing and having wives, more than one, increases the likelihood of young men being radicalized to get women and to get resources to have women. So we need to focus on institutionalized monogamy. We need to institutionalize greater aspects of gender equality to reduce this likelihood of terrorism. I think all that's going to do is backfire. And I mean, Boko Haram literally loosely translates to about, things that are forbidden, making sure that you're not learning things that are forbidden by Islam. You're going to have a lot of incoming. I would expect an escalation of terror in the area as the United States tries to focus on a more gender-oriented foreign policy in Africa. And needless to say, it is going to happen just as it's happened in the past, is that America implements a girls' school. Girls' school gets attacked. More people die. I would expect more
escalation. Yeah. Well, this is something that Moldbug says as well. He says that the strongest dissidents are the ones that are constantly persecuted, and such as we use the term what are Islamic terrorists but dissidents. I think that's something we'll have to deal with. And I know he's probably on the phone call, but it's a live stream and you hate dead air, don't you?
No, we're back.
Let's see. Epic. Let's see. So Gabe asks, could governors refuse to send troops from their state? I assume he's referring to on deployment. I think that the only governors are only in charge of their personal National Guard, right? Like state National Guard. Yes. So I mean, if we're talking about like Governor Cooper refusing to send troops from Fort Bragg, not really in that, is he?
Yeah, that's something that can't really happen. Now, there has to be instances where the National Guard gets federalized, and even then, that doesn't happen often enough. I mean, National Guard units do get deployed, and they do get sent off to the Middle East and other areas on training exercises, combat engagements, and tours. But I mean, even then, there's not enough sovereignty, I think, for the governors to just flat out say, nope, we're not going to send our boys over. It doesn't work that way. And yes, the Afri Forum and CC are great guys. I would love to get in touch with them on South African issues, because I don't know enough about South Africa, and I would love to learn. And America doesn't really engage enough, I think, with South Africa, excuse me, on those issues. I would love to learn more. Dan says, because that's never backfired before. Haha, see Iran. Yeah, that's very true. Gabe says, what if they tried? I'm just putting it out there. They can try.
Constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
But it would be
because from there, what would most likely happen is, say Governor Abbott says, fuck it, I'm not sending any Texas National Guardsmen to Iraq or Syria or wherever. I would imagine that the United States federal government would see it as a direct threat to its sovereignty and would probably put it down. Because at that point, right, you've just told the governor of a state has just told the federal government, I'm not letting you have access to my troops, my armed men who serve technically under my flag. No way in hell that doesn't get seen as a threat on its sovereignty of the federal government. I would just imagine that that's a really quick way to get something kinetic happening within American borders.
America engaged way too much with South Africa, toppled their previous system, and ended us up empowering the ANC Marxist Party in America.
In South Africa. All the more reason why I need to get in touch with these people and learn more, because I am grossly illiterate historically, other than the international efforts that were put on ending apartheid and ending essentially political protections for the minority. And that's how we have the issues that we see in South Africa today. The U.S. doesn't want to deal with South Africa, as U.S. black nationalists already take too much influence from the South Africans. This is one reason why the U.S. blocked peaceful splitting apart of the SAF to the Boer, Bantu, and Zulu nations. See, now I'm going to have to start talking to South Africans and learn more.
Right, that sounds very interesting. I also know nothing about. You wanted to talk about South America too, didn't you? We haven't even broached that topic really.
Oh no, we haven't. Although, in terms of South America, what I do see happening, at least in South America, is going to be, at the very least, in terms of, because you had sent me some things in regards to migration. And I know that we're going to probably see a resuming of American asylum policy, or a resuming of American migration to the United States. I mean, all that we're seeing now is those migrant caravans coming up, and they had that guy interviewed saying, we got to get up there. Biden's giving us 100 days. We got to move.
Yeah,
and then Blinken on that video in the confirmation hearings had stated that they shouldn't come here. And I don't know if he's been referring in the context of that video in regards specifically to the pandemic or to just the aspect of not coming here. In South America is interesting because you have now the president of Mexico, who, if I understand correctly, is a diehard leftist nationalist, who has been very critical. Who has been very critical of the power Silicon Valley has of deplatforming President Trump when he was still in office. And I'm not surprised, right? Because the United States has almost a century of Yankee interventionism in South America, in Mexico, Cuba, and various other nations. from the beginning of the 20th century that has continued onward. So it's kind of hilarious to see that AMLO, as he's known by many, is just like, yeah, this is fucked, and it's not even the American government that's exercising that much power. But this ties in.
I mean, any astute person knows, and I'm sure he knows, that the social media arm is just an extension of the government. And he, of course, I'm sure he's aware of that to some extent. But yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to lead into what Dan was saying in the chat. Do you think Biden could put economic sanctions on Brazil and other climate outlaws, quote unquote? There was some discussion a few months ago. I would imagine that might be a conversation, especially as the United States, Biden has rejoined the Paris Climate Accords. I wouldn't be surprised.
I was thinking
however,
about this,
I think Bolsonaro, though, would be ballsy enough to retaliate in some form or fashion. However, I do think that there would be international pressure to put some kind of economic sanction or some sort of trade block on these countries to encourage them to act in a specific way. I don't think Brazil's economy, especially after decades of corruption, decades of inflation, and decades of just widespread inequality, that it could survive being sanctioned the way that it does. But who knows? I think that Bolsonaro would fight back from it.
I think Bolsonaro's on the chopping block. The NGOs of the world that partake in the color revolutions are no fan of the strongman nationalists. So you were talking about Orban or Duda, or Putin in Europe. I think Bolsonaro is definitely on the chopping block, maybe to a lesser extent, though we know they're friendly towards communists. Obviously, Brennan is former CIA director, and the likes. Those people are friendly towards communists. We could see something else happen in Venezuela. So directly foreign intervention. And I don't even mean the government, though the government does work with these people. I just mean the private NGOs, the Norm Eisens. You know who Norm Eisen is, right? You've read The Revolver. Right. And Norm Eisen, on his birthday, had an article come out on Politico talking about him. And he was like, the question was, they asked a couple of questions and, like, what are you reading right now? And one of the questions was, what are you most excited about in the future? And basically he said, and if you read into it, like you always have to with these people that speak in Newspeak, he basically says that though people are afraid of the strongmen around the world, I'm not very concerned because I don't think they'll be around much longer. So he's referring to Putin, Duda. He's referring to Bolsonaro, and I think that they have plans. It doesn't mean they're going to be enacted. I mean, there's so much for the Biden administration to do. It's going to be difficult for them to probably handle everything that we're talking about here, but it's definitely an option. It's an option to destabilize Brazil through sanctions, and then color revolution in one way or another.
Mark's asking if you could expand on who Norm Eisen is.
Norm Eisen is a former ambassador to Czechoslovakia, worked closely with Obama. He was basically the head of the color revolution in, I believe, he partook in the Ukraine color revolution. He partook in the Slovakian revolution and the one in Yugoslavia. You can look him up on Revolver News by Darren Beatty. He does some great work. He worked closely with the Democrats this year in the lawsuits and in developing their strategy to quote unquote winning this election. So I think that's a fair synopsis of him. He's a diehard globalist. I mean, you can look at. I mean, I don't want to say that for obvious reasons, but he is a big fan of the global American empire, George Soros type of guy.
Well, there you go. Oh God, talk about Bad People Incorporated.
Yeah. Yeah, accurate.
Yeah. But I mean, and it does bring into a point though that I do think that you will see a renewed pressure on South America, especially as the United States has rejoined the Paris Climate Accords, and we have decidedly slashed our energy independence after we've decided to gut the Keystone XL pipeline, because we have been bitching about that for almost 10 years now. And we've gone on and off again about it. And I don't think that there's going to be any real recourse to it now that Biden is in office, which is unfortunate because American energy independence was probably one of America's strongest foreign policy positions. Because now all of this does is that it tells the rest of the world that the United States is going to play along with the climate politics, which means the conversation about climate outlaws will probably happen, although we won't target actual climate outlaws like India or China. We will reduce our ability to export energy abroad, which reduces our economic standing as well as our job position. But it also tells Europe, of all people, that America you cannot go to trade for energy, so they will be more reliant on Russia in the future. Which, I mean, Russia has been Europe's primary exporter of energy anyway, because the United States doesn't do enough to put pressure on. Well, I mean, it does. Just look at the cost of energy in Belarus. But it's not the European foreign policy establishment doesn't view the United States as a valid energy trading partner, because we seem to go back and forth on energy every 4 to 8 years or so. So there'll be more of that happening in the near future, I believe.
I mean, yeah, probably. I think the sooner that Europe detaches itself from America, the better. And I know it's like maybe an unpatriotic thing to say, but I guess, I mean, really it's not, though. Really it's not, because I hate what this country does abroad, and I hate what it stands for in a lot of regards. And if Angela Merkel wants to go her own way, then good. And I do want to keep some form of, and we've talked about this, and you know where I stand. I think we can still remain powerful, maybe without, having Europe as a vast state.
Mm-hmm. No, and I agree. And again, like I had said at the beginning of the stream, like I have lived under the privilege and benefit of American hegemony my entire life. Many of us have, who live in the United States and who live in European countries. I can hate the ideology that it rules under and how it operates, and that's what I would love to see change. That's why I think I have such a huge investment in my interest in foreign policy, because good statecraft can both ensure peace, but it can also ensure prosperity for your own nation. And I would like to see that happen. And I think that the current track record that, the global American empire has been under ideologically has been a disaster for its citizenry. And of course, that is done with some underlying intent, because when you can enrich yourself and have profit motive, by fucking over the American populace by having cheap labor while selling them with the idea of hedonistic, instant gratification of cheap and easily replaceable goods, you now have a culture that is dependent upon it, and that's where we're at. And I think that that's a huge problem, because it has its consequences. And we had a referendum on those consequences in 2016. And of course, the establishment fought back, and that's where we're at now in 2020 or 2021. And Raging Mandrill says maybe us allowing Russian money and access to Europe is good for us in the long term. And I'm inclined to agree for both cultural and economic reasons, because I think whatever can help undermine the European Union would be fundamentally good for Europe, because the European Union is organized Germanism by any other name, and organized Germanism has been proven in the last several hundred years to be a huge fucking problem for Europe, because every time Germany gets organized, whether it's the Holy Roman Empire, whether it's Bismarck, whether it's World War I and II, anytime Germany gets organized, the rest of Europe suffers the fucking consequences, and that's a problem. I very much hold to the British idea that the Germans are just innately bad for Europe.
Are you
the
Anglo?
True American... I am a descendant of a bunch of Irish immigrants that came to the United States in the 1840s. So it's not like I have cultural or, genealogically, it's not like I have a strong position on the Brits, but culturally I have a lot of respect for them. Organized Germanism, no, that's not my own expression. That comes from Peter Hitchens, and he's been holding on to that term for quite some time. The true American foreign policy position is isolationism. The true father of the conservative movement is Calvin Coolidge. Yes, and I highly recommend that anyone reads a good there's a really good biography on Calvin Coolidge. I'm gonna have to look it up now.
Yeah, I'm looking up the one that I just read a couple months ago.
Amity Shales is Coolidge was the one I read recently, that a few years back, that I thoroughly enjoyed.
Yeah, I was about to say Amity Shales is also the one I listened to, because when I worked at a farm. So I worked at a farm for a couple of years. Or a couple of months, a year, I guess. I would just put on an audio book and listen for like 8 hours straight while working. So got a lot of information in that way. The UK is a bigger problem than Germany. No, it's not. I disagree. I think the ideas that come out of the UK are not as harmful.
The UK, by extension, is a vassal state of the current, ideological regime of the American Empire. So, and in fact, if you want to hear the UK can bitch about it, Peter Hitchens has been just like lambasting the American UK special relationship for decades. They couldn't. Peter Hitchens, whom I have a lot of respect for, bitched about how the Clinton administration essentially treated the UK during the Good Friday Accords and the Good Friday Agreement as if it was some third world country the U.S. could simply intervene on. The U.S. relationship to the UK during the Iraq War was terrible, and it still is to this very day. But the UK is intentionally been weakened by the United States to a point where it is a vassal state, and Brexit will be taken advantage of in quite a way because of that. I think, especially with now that things are the way that it is. Europe needs to sort us in the Anglosphere out. I mean, I think that you can have two peaceful existences of the Anglosphere and the continent, and I'd leave it be at that point. That's how I would see it. I think that the two can peacefully coexist. I don't think that the Anglosphere needs to be continental, and I don't think that the continent needs to be anglicized. I think that the two need to be separated, and that's why I've been a proponent of Brexit since it was suggested back in the 90s.
The UK created eugenics. Okay, well, I mean, it doesn't. Okay, I don't think it really matters as much as the actual effects the countries have on America today. And at the moment, I think the World Economic Forum, the European Union, which is mainly, controlled by France and especially Germany, especially Germany now. Exactly. I think that's a much bigger threat to, I guess, our movement, to what we believe in. We're ideologically opposed to them more. UK just kind of lies dormant as, yeah, sure, global homo, but they're not pushing anything down our throats the same way the European Union is, which is ran by, like we said, the Germans. And we kind of have addressed Israel. We talked about it in passing early on in the stream, but I don't know if anything will change per se. I think they'll keep pursuing these peace deals. Hopefully, they might not. But
what we will see, I think, are two things. One is that because of the peace agreements that have taken place under the Trump administration, you are going to see an emboldened Israel, and particularly in attacking threats that are deemed existential, or to limit the ability to increase their spheres of influence. So places like Iran and the Palestinians will definitely see a more aggressive Israel in the future. And I think the United States, rhetorically, because a Democrat is in office, will give some sort of limp-wristed condemnation of loss of life or attacks, while still saying Israel is America's greatest ally, which is BS, but whatever. you'll see that happen. The second thing is that as Blinken has said that he would like to pursue renegotiations of the Iranian JCPOA about the Iran nuclear agreement. I think that will most likely be undercut by the Israelis because the Iranians are not going to stop in their pursuing of a nuclear weapon. I think that they are too ideologically driven by the hardliners in their government to stop doing that. However, I think that what that will entail is that the United States will most likely do what it can to curtail Israel from actually doing so. And I think that all it's going to do is escalate tensions in the area and increase the likelihood for conflict. Pedro says, if we keep fucking around in the Middle East, Israel will move to an alliance with Russia and China. Pedro, I would love for you to look up about American military technology secrets being sold to the Chinese and the Russians from the Israelis. They kind of already do that.
Yeah, they play us off each other pretty hard. It's
we get screwed around.
What they do
our
is
position
they sell this technology to France, and then France sells it to China or Russia, and and not even that, it goes much deeper. But Israel.
You can't trust them. Our position on Israel will, assuming American energy independence, will eventually soften. The cost of maintaining a friendship will be greater than the benefits. Yes, although because we have recently cut down our American energy independence, we are going to be a lot more reliant on the Israelis to provide military infrastructure as well as their own kinetic assault into the area to help maintain the strength of the petrodollar and to ensure that we have access to that energy.
You think that they're actually going to throw their own force behind something? You said kinetic.
Think they're gonna... So yes, because they've done it before. So in 2007, Bashar al-Assad was pursuing chemical and nuclear weapons, and the Israeli Air Force violated Turkish and Iraqi airspace to go into Syria and to bomb it. They've also done it in 2009 and 2010 with Stuxnet, which was a malware computer virus developed by the United States to stop Simian's computers that were working inside Iranian nuclear facilities. So I would not be surprised if we see more kinetic actions, both covert and more out in the open from the Israelis, especially now that America is reducing its energy independence and will be far more reliant upon OPEC and other oil-producing countries. I would not be surprised if Israel will be utilized as sort of an extension of American foreign policy in the area as they have been in the past. That is all but certain, especially now with American domestic manufacturing of oil and production is going to be decreased.
Yeah. Well, there you go. We talked about Israel. You happy?
Yeah, I would expect a lot more of the same, and with a lot more hard power usage in the area, especially now that Israel most likely feels emboldened from the peace agreements of the previous administration. However, what I will see happen, the same thing that we saw happen under the Obama administration, is that the next time that the Israeli Knesset wants to be have an election, which is most likely sooner rather than later, you will see American lobbyists, American electioneers, and American campaign managers in Israel working against the Likud party and trying to get a left-wing government installed into Israel. That happened during the Obama administration and failed, although they came close several times. It will happen again. Melphis says Israel has always been a part of America, or if you want to be spicy, it's the other way around. Israel is practically a state of America in all but name. Yeah, in part because American evangelicals, for some reason, it's a winning political strategy, or it was like 40 years ago. And it still is to this day. That's why you have conservative Inc. always touting pro-Israel positions, because for some reason we still think that the old evangelical line of, being supportive of Israel is still going to be a winning issue, and it's not. Al-Assad is going to get yeeted by Biden. Yeah, that's the plan. That's why we have troops in Syria still, and we've renewed our positions in Iraq near the Syrian border. It's going to happen, and they're going to try their best to yeet him out, and that's why we're probably going to see a resuming of arms sales and coalition of training and technical advisors on the ground to support terrorist groups, the YPJ and others that are Kurdish fighters in the region too, to oust them, even though al-Assad holds 85% of the territory inside Syria's borders, and there are just pockets of resistance in the northeast and in the southwest. So it'll be a long and bloody conflict that won't stop.
There will be nothing more obvious than if ISIS somehow surges up again. We will know
it's already happened.
They've done a bombing. They've done bombings throughout the whole Trump administration. There's a bombing in Kabul, or there's a bombing in Baghdad every other day. But the real thing is going to be if they are capable of actually taking action and forming another caliphate or something. That will speak extraordinarily well to the agenda, or to our narrative, which is, these people are running the show behind the scenes. They're doing this to hurt us. It would be so obvious. It will be nearly impossible to deny at that point. And Donald Trump said it in 2016. Hillary Clinton created ISIS, whether directly, indirectly, who knows anymore, right? But if ISIS does really resurge in a way that puts Assad on the brink, like he was, I think in 2015, he was basically on the brink. That's going to be a red pill. That's going to be very noticeable, and it's going to be a total tell as well. So that's my 2 cents in it, I guess.
Yeah. ISIS is active in Mozambique. Yeah, the ISIS and other terror groups are active in vast parts of sub-Saharan Africa and other parts in the continent. Evangelicals need to get over that emotional attachment. Yes.
As an evangelical, I agree. But I don't know if it's a tricky one though. There seems to be this very weird disconnect between what is good for people and what people want or like, and it's odd to say the least. And the love of Israel is one of those things. It's like there's this idea that because they're God's chosen people, and there is a passage in the scripture that says that if you bless the nation, it will bless you. But I think that's Old Testament, and more importantly, I don't think we're blessing the people of Israel by constantly going to war with the rest of the world. So it depends how you would want to broadly define blessings or not. But yeah, the evangelical thing, I think we're getting there. I think that's another thing that we've woken up to in the past couple of years here is that the left has definitely come out strong against Israel. It used to be a bipartisan agreement where everybody is like, yeah, Israel. But now the left has come out against it, and the right, there are factions among the right that are starting to openly be like, hey, wait a minute, what are we doing? This doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So the other comment was about, what about Nicaragua and Venezuela? So Venezuela, ironically enough, Blinken has supported the American regime change policy of the Trump administration of trying to topple Maduro and put in Juan Guaido as the current quote-unquote legitimate leader of the country. There have continued sanctions. The sanctions are still in place in a lot of the Maduro regime, despite in the 2020 December elections, the Maduro loyalists won 91 seats within their legislative body. So it's definitely going to be an issue there. As for what will happen in the future, I think you're going to see more resistance from the Venezuelan people and their government, who are still loyal to Maduro, as well as more outside influence and pressure. So you will probably see the Iranians, you will see the Russians and the Chinese try and put political pressure against the United States from doing so, especially when John Kerry, during his tenure as Secretary of State, said that the Monroe Doctrine is outdated. So it's not like the United States has a foreign policy leg to stand on in this issue. This is, again, more and more of what can be classically described as Yankee imperialism in the area. So, but they're going to continue that policy. And why? I mean, Venezuela has some of the world's largest oil reserves on Earth. They have antagonized American companies by nationalizing and taking over, equipment and territory in the region and within their borders, which of course the United States isn't going to stand for. And why not implement someone who can sell you oil for cheap as you reduce your own dependence on domestic production of liquid natural gas and oil in your own country? So there's logic to it, and it just feels a little too Dick Cheney for me. But that's what we'll see with Venezuela, is a continuation of what we saw under the Trump administration. And it's going to be this really weird, incestuous political bedfellows of neoliberals arguing for trade and human rights, and the Charlie Kirk Turning Point USA type saying socialism sucks and get rid of Nicolas Maduro, even though we're probably going to fuck over the, majority of the civilians that are living under the current regime as it is, between the sanctions and what we've already done so far. So that's what I expect to see out of the current administration in Venezuela, is just more or less more of the same from what we saw under Trump.
Yeah, I roughly agree. Though I was, how do I say this? I was kind of not focusing very much because Jack just retweeted Charlemagne, quote tweeted, actually, kind of getting in a little bit of a sniping contest right now, and talking about the future of elections in the USA. But I don't know. Do you want to talk about that, or do you want to keep going down this foreign policy conversation?
I mean, I'll deviate, because if Jack Posobiec's retweeting or quote tweeting Charlemagne, I'd like to read this. So, okay. Charlemagne tweeted, "A horrible feature of conservatives is that they cannot let go of their worst traditions. He implies the Patriot Party will hurt the GOP, as if we ought to be defending it at this point, and also fails to realize that the only election mechanism that matters anymore is the oligarchy," because Jack Posobiec tweeted a picture of the Patriot Party and how third-party candidates affect elections, showing a 1992 margin election map of what happened when a third-party guy got into the White House, or tried to run for the White House. So Jack Posobiec quote tweeted 3 minutes ago, "A Yarvin Light guy says he doesn't care about elections, but has big thoughts on election tactics." Did Charlemagne reply directly, or no? No, you said he's not wrong. That's true.
No, I mean, he's not. Charlemagne is correct when he says that the feature of conservative, or horrible feature of conservatism, is that they can't let go of the worst traditions. I think he's kind of wrong when he says that there's no hope for elections anymore and it's all oligarchy. I kind of disagree with him in that regard. I think there is some hope. But this, okay, a couple of things here. Jack talking about Yarvin is a good thing. The way that my accounts have mostly gained followers, my past Twitter accounts, which have all been ruthlessly destroyed by Jack Dorsey, the way I've gained the most followers is by getting in Twitter spats with people who are much bigger than me. It's not a good thing, but it works. So I think that it's a good thing for growing his following. I guess it's cool, but he's not wrong, and it's exciting, I guess, to see that even Jack is talking about Yarvin, and we all know he's been breaking into the cathedral. But
yeah. I had said, I think prior to the stream, is that I still think that it's a two-front conflict in this culture war. I think that if we want to disengage and disassociate, you need people that are willing to fight in the current institutions and the current structure of things in order to buy you time, so the rest of the right wing can disassociate freely. But that's a conversation for a later time. Pedro says, "What should we do about Afghanistan? I think we should let the Taliban take over because they will invade Pakistan." Thoughts?
Chaos.
So the Trump administration tried its best to implement a withdrawal agreement and have a peace deal with the Taliban in the area, which has been muddy at best. Now, Melphis points out that Pakistan is allied with the Taliban and actively funds them as a sidearm of the Chinese government, which is true. So the Taliban are not going to be engaging or attacking Pakistan. That will not happen. Not to mention, Pakistan is a nuclear-armed state. There's no way in hell that you would want to risk a state actor getting involved with a nuclear armed state, especially when you're not a nuclear armed country yourself, which is Afghanistan. Now, I think that whether or not Blinken wishes to pursue that peace deal is unlikely, as he wishes to have a buildup of troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. So it is highly unlikely that they will either resume negotiations or pursue anything under the same umbrella as the Trump administration. I don't see it happening. I disagree with Charlemagne on elections not working. Fraud is a tool which can be turned on or off. It cannot be used too often or it will become noticeable and undermine regime credibility. Yes, but I think Charlemagne's logic, and I can't speak for him, but based on how I understand it, is that the regime doesn't necessarily care about credibility, because when half the population is cheering on the silencing, deplatforming, and the outright elimination of Orange Hitler, I don't think that they care. Pakistan only backs the Taliban because they destabilize Afghanistan. Yeah, but at the same time, Pakistan backs the Taliban because it's also an extension of the Chinese, as was mentioned earlier, because it's going to be just the way that it is, especially as China continues with its Silk Road initiatives, its infrastructure banks in the area. They may not agree ideologically, and they may not have to, but at the same time, it keeps the Americans at bay, and it keeps Western interests at bay, which has been one of the greatest ideological concerns that goes back all the way to a very astute and austere religious scholar named Osama bin Laden back in the early 2000s. So that's the main issue there. And now the comment section is just talking about fraud and
it's a good conversation.
It is a good conversation, yeah. Jack Posobiec talking about Charlemagne. What a good man. Today's been a fun day.
Yeah, I agree. Let's see, what is Mark saying? Fraud is a secondary problem. The main problem is fixing of election in the primaries. When you only get choice of Obama or McCain, it's not organic nor meaningful. I agree. And I think that the conservative party in America is going to work very hard to make sure that Trump never happens again. But I don't know if they're going to be able to do that. Obviously, the Democrats did it in 2016 and 2020, but we'll see if the Republicans can copy their method. The shenanigans this time around were significant, specifically because they couldn't fix the primaries due to Trump's popularity. Yeah,
and that's the thing, is that traditionally the fix has always been in the primaries. I mean, the real wake-up call for a lot of people who've been paying attention to politics was 2012, when they fucked over Ron Paul, and they purposefully changed the rules at the Republican National Convention to pretty much keep him from saying anything and to keep him from having his delegates at all. To mount a challenge to Mitt Romney. So the fix is usually done in the primaries, and we saw that this year with the Democratic primary, between the shady shit that happened with that shadow app at the Iowa caucuses, everyone bowing out who was considered establishment neoliberal candidates the day before Super Tuesday to back Joe Biden. The fix has always been in the primaries. They just couldn't do it this time. With this election. Unnoticeable, but always there. Yes, my favorite sort of conversation about elections and the issues of fraud is Moldbug's article on unqualified reservations called Behold the River of Meat, discussing how you'll never really get an audit in the United States. They would be considered racist, and the people that run the DMV are the people that count your votes, and they don't look like you, and that's a problem, and that's how we get where we're at. Pedro Garcia says the Chinese use Pakistan as a stick to poke India. If you fill it with terrorism, that stops Chinese expansion and makes them spend more resources. Yes, however, because India and Pakistan are nuclear armed states and they constantly battle and have skirmishes over Kashmir, and they've happened more recently in the last 8 months or so, the terror issue isn't necessarily the problem. It's making sure that two nuclear armed states don't engage in traditional kinetic warfare. Now, because of the diplomatic ties and how these two negotiate, the Chinese have been also involved in this more recently. using Pakistan to poke India isn't as bad when the Chinese have recently placated India with territorial border security agreements, which probably helps making it easier.
Yeah.
And Dan just said that Charlemagne replied.
Yeah. But another thing about Pakistan is that it has always been an interest for China because it is a seaport that usurps India, basically. And I think that it's kind of important to keep Pakistan around. But it's also a problem because if they decide to work with China in that regard, then we have another problem of giving China more leverage, which is, obviously a problem.
Yeah, and that's where we're at. Charlemagne says, nice Chad hominin. I'll give you that, but you're still BTFO. Whew. Oh, man, what a fun time. Well, this stream has been all over the place today, and not that I mind.
It's been pretty consistent.
Yeah, we managed to go over a variety of topics, trade, China, immigration. Pakistan has bad blood with the USA as well, as they were discarded in favor of India by the USA. Thus, Pakistan has a vested interest in being anti-American. Yes, they do have a vested interest in being anti-American because the United States places an emphasis on its relationship with India. But I mean, the foreign policy establishment has always been that you're traditionally supposed to get along, quote unquote, with democratic states better than you are with non-democratic states. But the United States also historically has backed sort of the UK relationship between India and Pakistan. And our position from the partition of India, which led to Pakistan's creation, probably doesn't help either because the United States was supportive of it. Which, of course, brings the long vested interest of being anti-American in Pakistan's favor. And, of course, the Pakistani government is allegedly, of course, I mean, we found Osama bin Laden inside Pakistan, so not too far from a military academy. So it's not like we have the world's best relationship to begin with them, and I don't see it improving in this administration or any future administration anytime soon.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, but I think Pakistan is like one of these states that you really can't do anything about unless you want to do really coercive actions against them because they are that nuclear power, because they are kind of set up on the world stage as a real legitimate player. I would put them alongside of someone like Poland when it comes to geopolitical capital or geopolitical legitimacy, whereas someone like nobody knows anything about the Iraqi government, mainly because we've destroyed it multiple times over, but Pakistan rather has some legs to stand on, and one of those legs being a nuclear arsenal, which is, yeah. So I think letting Pakistan fall to the hordes of Islamic radicalism is not an ideal option.
Yeah, and I mean, the fact that Pakistan is a nuclear armed state undermines any sort of going forward because, again, at that point, the politics of nuclear deterrence plays a role, and you don't fuck around with a nuclear armed state, especially one that ideologically disagrees with you at every turn. So the traditional engagement would from there take precedence.
Iraq, an Iranian puppet state. I don't know. I just don't know anymore.
Yes, Iraq. So Iraq has been an Iranian puppet state really since the United States has been fighting ISIS. Because if you look up what Iran has been doing in Iraq, what they've been doing has been sending Iranian-backed militias and members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard into Iraq to pretty much settle down, take up local office, run for their parliament, have sway in the elections. And the Iraqi and Iranian government have, of course, sizable Shia populations, which, of course, means that they're probably going to be more aligned on religious and ideological basis than they would with other Arab states. And yes, Iraq has become an Iranian puppet state, despite the fact that the American government has spent almost 30 years of trying to exert its foreign influence into the area, and changing governments and trying to implement nation building, which has failed empirically. All this Pakistan nuke talk reminds me about tropical winds in India and how the fallout with the winds onto Mexico and California coast, according to some studies. Yeah, the tropical winds actually are a problem even now, and it doesn't even have to affect nuclear fallout. So, for instance, in Los Angeles and in San Francisco, there were studies that were conducted of air pollution and particulates in the air that were not from the United States. They were from China. Yet we won't confront the Chinese on climate change or pollution or anything, despite the fact that upwards to like 25% of the pollution in California doesn't even come from California. So it's an absolute nightmare.
Well, it's been 2 hours. Good conversation.
Well, it has been a
hit a wall.
It's been quite a bit of conversation. I appreciate everyone coming to participate in the chat. We've got 31 people watching. I'm very thankful for everyone who's tuned in to listen to us ramble and go over all sorts of conversation and topics. I'm still getting used to the live streaming thing. This is, I think, the third time I've done one. I've been on Dawn stream. Actually, this is the fourth one then. I've been on Dawn stream. I've done 2 on my channel, and we've done this one now as the third. And DC, I'm always glad that you can come on. I always enjoy talking with you.
Well, thank you. I enjoy the conversations we have as well.
Yeah. So I'm just going to make a few announcements before we wrap up here then. So this Thursday, I will be doing another live stream. This one will be on Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolutions in France. We'll be talking about the French Revolution, and I will be doing some selective readings from Edmund Burke's document himself. So I think that'll be fun. And at the end of that stream, I will list out a list of books that will be the basis of the book club. So every month, I will hopefully do my best to do a new book. I'll have read it. I'll have done my notes, and we'll do live stream on it and conversation. I would hope that you guys read along with me, and we can have you guys come on the chat and as well as on the live stream, and we can have a conversation about it, which I look forward to it. And then as soon as I get off of this stream here, I will be editing and uploading my Monday morning musings, which is my sort of weekly sort of unscripted extemporaneous remarks on something that's been on my mind, and gives you guys a chance to reflect on some of the things I've been thinking about in the world of politics and in the culture war, and gives you guys a chance to discuss everything. So again, to all my new subscribers, I'm really thankful that you guys have stopped by and decided to give my channel a chance. I'm definitely not going to stop now that the academic agent's given me a shout out. And I'm really glad that those of you who are from AA's community have decided to stop by. I've been a huge fan of his work, and one day I hope to be on with him. So, DC perspective, do you want to shill your channel and what you talk about?
Yeah, DC. It's my Twitter account, Carlson second, and my channel link you can find, and I talk about elections, politics. I'm just doing that. It's like on here, but I actually know I'm in the process of doing a lot of that stuff in regards to politics. Basically, I'm excited to see what the future holds. There's a Bloomberg article in the chat that says how Biden can support the next Arab Spring, or new Arab Spring. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, you might want to try doing that again, because the chat's saying that you roboted and cut out.
Yeah, it sucks. Yeah. Anyways. My YouTube channel is Perspective. My Twitter is Carlson second, and my 6th account. And my links are all on a link tree at my Twitter. Was I roboting then too? Can you understand me?
No, you were much better that time.
Amazing. Yeah, that's basically it. Thanks for having me, man.
Oh, no problem. I mean, I enjoy getting to hear your perspective of things. Like we had mentioned prior to the stream starting, is that we come from a little two different perspectives. I came from sort of a traditional normie conservative, and I've become a little more neo-reactionary in the last year and a half. And you, of course, are more from the America First crowd. And while we may have like some slight ideological differences, I think that we agree on like 85% of things, and it's always nice to share perspective. So let me go post a link to your Twitter, actually, because apparently I can't put links in the chat from other people. So let me take care of that right now.
If you ever mod me,
I should mod you, huh? Wow, boy, I should do that, huh? Well, let me go to YouTube. Yeah, neither have I, actually. This is all new to me, but I can take care of that. Well, right now, actually, before this all ends. But yeah, let me go make sure that we can post things in the chat and take care of all that.
Yeah, but an article which said
you're roboting again.
Which is it's the CIA.
There you go.
The CIA.
Well, there you go.
It's true.
Yeah, but so I will. Let me just go add your Twitter link in here, and then I'll put that in the chat, and I'll make sure that you're a moderator in the future. So this is his Twitter account. It's in the chat now. You can all go follow him. If you ever want an interesting perspective of the America First crowd that isn't entirely crazy, DC perspective is the way to go. And Mark, I will also mod you as well.
Partly crazy.
Yeah, well, I mean, all ideologies are a little bit crazy. Otherwise, we wouldn't adhere to them. But thank you all for showing up. I will make sure in the future I'll have some mods in the chat as well. Mark is definitely one of my most constructive critics, and I don't know what I'd do without him. So thank you for being here, Mark. I appreciate it. So everyone else, thank you all for coming and attending. I will see you all on Thursday at the same time at around 12 o'clock Central Time. We will be doing some readings on Edmund Burke and talking about the French Revolution. And we'll be talking about the book club that will be coming afterwards. And then stay tuned later today for some Monday morning musings. I'm the Prudentialist. This has been DC Perspective. We talked a little bit about foreign policy, and I'll see you all next time. Take care, guys.